Welcome to People Are the Point. I'm your host, Mark Concannon. Let's talk about the people.
Hi, I'm Mark Concannon, host for People Are the Point. Today, I have Neil Farquharson, who is Technical Project Manager at GHX, which is a global exchange platform for the healthcare industry. Neil is a grandfather, father, global traveler, longtime consultant, and always maintaining his development skills to ensure he had fallback throughout his career, but ultimately never had to fall back on that, but rather uses it as a tool and a passion. Thank you for joining. Well, Neil, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Where are you joining us from Denver today?
Yep. Beautiful late summer day.
Now, you started out your life in New Zealand. It was a kind of roundabout trip to get you to Denver. You've been there for a while, though, now. Has it been maybe 20 years in Denver now?
About 27 years, yes.
And what brought you there?
So I arrived, that was a second trip. I actually ended up working in Dallas, Texas. I worked for an international company, a big fire protection company. And I ended up in Dallas and ended up working there for 3 years for the guy one of my old bosses from New Zealand who had been seconded to Dallas. And working there is where I met my wife. And we moved back to New Zealand for 10 years, had our children there, but eventually always wanted to move back to the States. When we moved back, we sort of looked around the country and figured out that Denver was probably the best of all worlds. And we haven't really regretted it at all.
A beautiful city. I know I miss it often. So that's why I try to get back to the skiing. Nice. But I know, obviously, New Zealand is where you start out. Something Americans were not always as in tune with other opportunities in the world as we should be. And I know you shared with me once that part of being in New Zealand, being part of the UK, it gave you access to other countries, including England. So you spent a little time over there earlier in your career, is that right?
Yeah, I originally trained as a school teacher, but both my parents were born in Great Britain, in Scotland specifically, but both moved to New Zealand when they were children. So I had sort of like a birthright citizenship to the UK. So I only taught for about a year and a half and then decided to do what in New Zealand we call a big OE, big overseas experience. So at that stage, most New Zealanders either went overseas for some time, either to Australia or generally to the UK because they could get easy access into the UK. And I lived in London for 2 years, various sort of fun jobs because I was 20. And I actually got introduced to a computer programmer, an Irish guy who was permanently drunk, but I got paid a lot of money and turned up to work about 10 o'clock every morning and left about 6 o'clock every night. And I've had to actually work with this guy to reconcile an old manual asset register to the new computerized asset register that this company had. And that sort of tweaked my interest in computer programming. So when I returned to New Zealand after my 2 years overseas, I sort of went and took a COBOL programming course. And I learned COBOL programming on a Honeywell level 6 and ended up tutoring to that company that taught me for another 3 months. And then I got my first job as a junior programmer doing COBOL on a Burroughs mainframe for this international fire protection company I worked with.
Down Dallas.
Yep.
Yeah.
And eventually got to Dallas. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned you started off and formally trained as a teacher. You went on to do obviously programming as a piece.
Mm-hmm.
Did you take along any of the lessons from like learning how to be a teacher, or did you just find programming was a natural thing and human interactions were natural for you? Teaching ended up being, you said tutoring was part of what you ended up doing for them.
Yeah. And that did help, so obviously, and I never really had any problems doing that sort of work, like teaching people and that sort of thing. It just sort of came naturally to me, but I really enjoyed the building construction of software programming. I've always liked that. And although now I've sort of moved past it, or I should have moved past, I still do a lot of programming in, namely Python. I do a lot of Python programming just to solve data problems for colleagues I work with. I get data in all sorts of different formats, at either in an Excel spreadsheet or XML or text files, and we need it in a more structured format, process it through our systems. So that stuff comes extremely easily to me, so I enjoy doing it.
Obviously, when we met, we were both in consulting and there was a lot of travel involved. Did you find that as your kids got a little older, you felt pulled to be home more? Did the kids influence your decision to go out of consulting?
That was the main thing at the end, right? So when we first moved here, my kids were younger, 5 and 7 when we arrived. And so I spent 8 years in the consulting business and was a road warrior. So that a lot of that time was take off on Sunday afternoon to get back to the East Coast, to come back Thursday night or Friday. But when the kids got into high school, my wife sort of just asked me, she said, look, I can't deliver two, kids at one stage. One was in middle school, one's in high school, different schools. And so she sort of said, when they got into high school, could I please look for another job and not travel as much? And at that stage, I was really lucky. I actually was flying back from Chicago, from a project in Chicago, from Chicago, and I ended up sitting next to a mutual contact of ours, Paul Parrish, and he was working for this healthcare company, and he sort of said, you want to get off the road? And I said, yeah. And he says, okay. And he lined it up, and I ended up working for the next 8 years for a healthcare provider here in Colorado, which was a lot of fun, but it was down the bottom end of Colorado, Denver area. So the commute was really bad, but I enjoyed the job. And then I was lucky enough to actually get a job. And so for the last 12, 13 years, I've been working for the same company on the north side, well, actually in Louisville, Colorado, a company called GHX, Global Healthcare Exchange, which does basically EDI and healthcare supply chain services for the US market and in Europe.
Well, I know obviously a very long career with a broad range of experiences. You've seen everything from everyone in the office every day to you had to travel to get to the client sites. Then we went through COVID and everything kind of stopped. I don't know where your organization stands now on back to work. What are your thoughts? Do you find a lot of reward in being in the office? You used to live the commute just to be present. What are your thoughts on the current environment and how companies are handling that?
It's mixed. There's the good and the bad of it. There's GHX, who I currently work for, is a remote first company. So there's no requirement to be in the office. Although we do have offices in Louisville, but all of our other office locations in the US have been shut down over time. So the vast majority of the workforce is field staff and remote. We do maintain this office. We come in a lot of Tuesdays because they give us lunch. So that gets a lot of people. So a lot of the people that are Denver based come in on Tuesdays because they get a free lunch. And that's where we have our team meetings. So the good thing about it, and they're very sort of relaxed. They've got a flexible PTO policy. So, you take your PTO when it suits you best. And they're very good at that. The downside of it is you do lose a little bit of that contact. I tend to come into work at least 2 days a week. And there's a core dozen people that come in every week for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. The downside of it is I do think for as much as, Microsoft Teams and Zoom products have allowed you to have a remote workforce and to get together and collaborate online, we were lucky when COVID hit because we had already started getting into using Zoom. So it came very natural for us. So from a work point of view, COVID didn't affect us very much at all. But over the long period, trying to do all of your meetings on Zoom, Teams, it just loses a little bit. There's a lot, you just don't get everything in there. So I think there is a little bit of loss. What you lose by not being with other people is the hallway conversations, the little bits on the side. Hey, what do you think we can do about this? Or I've got this problem, or blah, blah, blah. Now, if you want to figure that stuff out, you have to use Zoom meetings or you have to use Slack or something else like that. You have to type everything else if you're using Slack. Whereas a lot of things were solved very quickly when you actually had that face-to-face interaction with your colleagues or in various groups. And it used to be like, even in my early days working for other companies, there was a lot of work that was achieved after hours, sitting around a whiteboard doing that. And I know the technology is getting there to be able to do that, but we're not quite there yet.
We still lose the nuances of the unspoken gesture, a look on their face, reading it immediately and being able to adjust on the moment. We've definitely seen in a meeting where we're stuck on something with a project, just pulling everyone in the room and just hammering out that one problem. We can get it done sometimes in an hour or two, when it can go on for weeks if it's left remote.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's developed in industry now that I don't think is entirely productive or as productive is the way they delineate between the various business functions within a company. And this is not unique to my company. This is a lot of companies do this. You all want to break down your information silos, right? You want enterprise visibility to certain data and certain functionality. But the way now that, you have product, you have sales, you have marketing, you have development, you have support, those sort of business groups in there, because they all now tend to work up to their own VP structure, there is these lines of demarcation between functions, which, because you're now remote, I think become accentuated. Whereas I could go over to a I work in product. I used to be able to go over and just casually talk to one of the development team and say, hey, why does this do this? What was your thinking behind it? Or to try and express my opinion about it. But now, development's development and product's product. And if you want to talk to each other, you got to do it in a more formalized process. So I think you just lose about things. And you have to do it again and again and again. And it takes, to me anyway, it takes a lot longer to do things, which used to be fairly simple. Like you just don't seem like you and I worked together on a product that, had a development environment, and you could often just go up to say, hey, see that little drop-down box? That's not working correctly. Oh, I'll fix it. Bang, done. End of story. Now it has to be a Jira ticket.
Yeah.
And it has to go through, and it has to get prioritized, and it has to go through, and, it just becomes a little bit more difficult to manage. And it's managing expectations, like there's a lot of time where we're asked to create a roadmap. What are we going to do development-wise in the next quarter and the next 6 months, and you spend a lot of effort doing that. Then when you get all of the teams together about it, no, we can't do that. That's going to have to drop off. It's all about managing money and resources and everything, but it just seems.
I like your point that the formal structure ends up having small items suffer and end up low in queue, even though they can be a key component to the experience for the user. They're not critical to the system in some ways, and so they don't get addressed as quickly.
Yes. Yeah. And there's more. I think it also develops a whole lot more overhead in the whole process, right? Modern companies now have departments that never used to exist before, or role functions, like now, like how do you, like something I work for now, we've got multiple products in multiple areas, all generally around healthcare. But how, as a leadership team, do you keep track of what's going on across all of these? So over the years, we went down the whole agile. So we're generally an agile shop. But then you started getting different tools, and the tools, things like Remedy for an agile structure. And you end up spending a lot of money on that. Then you try to keep track of what are all of these business ideas that we want to develop. And we use products like AHA, which is really good. They are really good. But you just, over time, start building up this hierarchy or this huge umbrella of all of these products to try and track what you're doing, what you want to do, what you're doing, what's prioritized, where you are with the process. Whereas it used to be, you might just have a fairly simple project management system or spreadsheet to do it. Now there's this whole new genre of products that all of these companies now have. And, and you add to that, you add Zoom, you add Slack, you add Teams, you add enterprise, Office Enterprise.
Yeah, you're touching on something there that, it starts to lead into the thinking is that as AI becomes developed enough and advanced enough, maybe there's a specialized one for certain purposes or other purposes, but that we're just not there yet, right? Because in theory, then the AI could watch what you're doing, be your assistant, track those things without you interacting with any system except for it, or the function of updating something. That's the theory. So let me back up. But the question I have is, you're in the healthcare space. I was listening to another podcast recently talking about some VC and enterprise organizations saying they're not seeing enterprise-ready AI being deployed for production-ready functions. But we're working on an AI product right now that we believe meets that criteria. We're definitely hearing about other organizations that have those pieces coming in. But in healthcare, are you seeing that start to come up? Do you feel like it's becoming mature enough for healthcare organizations to deploy in a way that impacts every day? Or do you think it's still too...
There's definitely a lot of resources and effort and visibility from leadership being put into this. It is a priority. It is seen at this stage as being an important part. So, our company, like AI-driven supply chain is a phrase you will hear. We have large amounts of data, purchase order history for a lot of medical device manufacturers, from nearly, 85% of all of the hospitals in the United States. We have all of that information. It's all sitting on AWS in Snowflake databases. It's easy to get at. It performs very fast. And we have all of our own knowledge bases, which we have exposed to GH chat, sort of like stuff. But it's finding, let's find something that is production worthy. And ideally you want it to be able to make you money, because you're spending a lot of money on this stuff. So we've got a lot of those. We've got the simple things that are making, that are the low hanging fruit, those, language models. So, a lot of the salespeople can sort of say, hey, create a proposal for this, for that, asking for this, for that, and blah, blah. And it'll come up with a screen of paragraphs that you can use a base. It's often very hard when you're writing something, unless you're really good at writing. It's very hard to get started. But once you've got something, it's a lot easier if somebody gives you something and say, hey, review that and change it, than it is to write it from the start. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit with that, but you've got to beware, because one of the things we've found is that AI just makes stuff up.
Exactly. Hallucination. They're real.
Something's completely wrong, and then it all reads well. It's a proper sentence. It's grammatically correct. It's just wrong. That's all it is. So we're doing that. So the idea is to try, and we've built all of the models, and we've got a whole team, which has executive sponsorship all the way down. So there's nothing missing in the effort. But, it's trying to find that. I think one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is with AI is, how can we use AI to be a little bit more predictive? One of the things that cost healthcare, cost providers and suppliers, so to speak, a lot of money is back orders. Back orders are just terrible things to have in healthcare. Because if you're scheduled a surgery and you've ordered, a new hip for somebody, and you've got the day of the surgery and that hip doesn't arrive, then you've got to delay the surgery. So, back orders are not good things. And that can go from, it doesn't have to be the expensive items. Just remember COVID. Look what happened when we didn't have personal protective equipment, like masks and gowns and all that sort of, if you don't have that and you don't have gloves, you basically have to shut down a care unit, because you just can't service it safely. So what we're trying to do is say, can AI help with this? The other thing that's really we're trying to do is we're trying to manage content. We're trying to manage products in catalogs, and we're trying to see if we can use AI to discover more meaningful information about products from their descriptions. Because you don't actually just have a product name, it might have a size, and it might have a color, or it might be able to be used with a different product and all of this. So we rely on the suppliers to give us that information, but it's not always easy for them to give us this information. That information may exist somewhere else in their organization. And a lot of these are huge medical device manufacturers, global companies. So it's not always easy to get something from that's controlled by another department. So what we're trying to do is just use AI to try and sort of say, hey, can you look at this, and can you look at that and say, hey, that little string in the description looks like size information. Can I pull that out and put it somewhere that it can be sort of described as size information or color or packaging? What does it come? Is it an each? Or is it a box of, is it a box of 5? Is it a case of 100? Try and find all of that information, because that becomes important for supply chain, for people when they're ordering. You want to order a box of 5. You don't want a case or a pallet of 1,000, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
You're trying to find all of that information out.
Yeah, that makes sense. So along those lines, we're talking about AI. There's some people that are scared that someday it's going to take all of our jobs. I remember early in your career, you told me you always hang on to your coding skills. If anything ever went wrong, you can always fall back on coding. And it sounds like even now as a leader in the organization, you still do some coding to help solve problems. Is there a skill that you advise your kids to hold on to so they're ready for the next stage in the workforce?
Boy, I'm not sure. I think it's always being able to read and think things through. I've always thought reading is important. You should always read. You can, whether it's on an electronic device, you've got to have a broad spectrum of what you read.
But I think I'm hearing critical thought, right? Is what you're describing? So
critical thought. Critical thought is extremely important. And boy, I would sort of say it is diminishing.
Yeah, agreed.
It's, and that's because, we're warned even with this, with this GPT and stuff like that. You have to look at it. You have to query it, because the lack of critical thinking is that you've got to actually have the skills to be able to look at something and go, well, that's not right. And I can always remember one company I did work for in the consulting game, the chief sales, the VP of sales of this company, he managed all the sales stuff, and he always asked them when they put together a sales proposal when it went south or something, or did well, he always asked the question, what was your thinking? What were you thinking you were proposing? And what did you think was going to be the financial outcome for the company? And I'm not sure that critical thinking is such a strong suit now. Well, there's always going to be those people that they just key on that sort of stuff and they ask the right questions. But yeah, critical thinking is extremely important. And by also with critical thinking is being able to look at things logically is also.
Well, I know on a personal front, obviously you mentioned your children got to a certain point, it influenced maybe a career change to be around home more. Being a grandfather, did that change anything, or is it more just trying to make sure you get time?
No, it hasn't really changed. My kids are both married, both got kids, got their homes and all that. So no, as a parent, I'd sort of say, hey, they're stable and they're happy, and I don't have to worry about them as much, So now I just get to be, my wife and I just get to be grandparents and spoil grandkids. And then
that's awesome. And then obviously, I think we were talking earlier about more time for your golf. Is your game getting better?
It is. Not much, but it's getting better. I don't have blowouts like I used to, like this. I'm a bogey golfer, and that's where I'm quite happy with being a bogey golfer. Get a few pars, get the occasional birdie, and just don't blow up as much as I used to.
Well, probably in Denver was maybe October. It's supposed to become inhospitable for golf. So did you find time to steal off to Vegas or somewhere that's got year round, or you just stick to your season?
Yeah, no, we always had my wife and I always had the dream of, becoming snowbirds and getting the place in Florida or Arizona or something like that. I probably left it too late. 5 years ago, you could have probably got something fairly reasonable, but like everywhere in the States, it's getting more expensive. now is more inclined to sort of say, hey, let's just make sure we get away for a week or two in the winter when it gets really cold, like this. So it's more going to be, hey, January, February, let's go and do either a week in Hawaii or a week in Florida or a week somewhere else, or just hope that we find somebody that's got a place in Florida that we can stay at.
Come down anytime, Neil. You're always welcome. Well, thank you for the time today. I really appreciate us being able to get this pod recorded and you making a little time.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Look forward to catching up with you real soon, mate.
Absolutely, Neil.